Hello, IBCF Church. This is Brother Craig again. And I thought I'd move outdoors today to do a little talk with you today out of the Torah. Now, the word Torah in the ancient Hebrew, again, remember it means teaching. So God wants to teach his people who are following him. And so what we're doing is we're going through the book of Exodus, and right now we're sort of parked right at Mount Sinai, and we're building off of the very commandments that God gave as we know them as the 10 Commandments. And so last week we talked about employment and slavery, and we talked about other issues as well. And now we're talking about another issue, which is theft. You know, theft is a really, really big problem nowadays. And what we have in our church and what we've seen in our church is we've seen many of our people who have suffered from theft. Theft has become so commonplace that it's gotten to be not a big deal to many people in the government. It's just, and many businesses will just consider theft the cost of business. But our own police force and our prosecutors and the court systems have been so overwhelmed by the theft problems that now they don't even prosecute theft unless somebody is stealing more than $1,000 in value from somebody's house. Now, if it's stolen from a store, that's different, but if somebody steals from your house, then it's considered not a major thing, and you know they'll investigate it a little, but no charges will be brought because the government has decided not to prosecute those kinds of things. Theft is a huge problem. Theft breaks down trust between people, and so Yahweh is very, very serious about this. He does not want people to feel like they can't trust their neighbors and they can't leave their house, they can't leave their possessions anywhere. So he has certain things that he says about this. And so we left off last week in Exodus chapter 21. Let's move into now the whole subject of restitution. And we just pick up part of this when we get into the last few verses of chapter 21. But let's move into chapter 22, because now chapter 22 is going to start dealing with more of the issues related to trust and theft, or just restitution. Maybe some things happen because of natural disasters, or a theft occurs and nobody knows about it, nobody knows who did it. Okay, well, what do? God wants to give some basic principles for this. This is not by any means an exhaustive list of things that God could say, okay? But this is something that I want you to keep in mind. Let's go here I'm going to read to you, and I want you to think about this not in terms of animals, but now thinking about it in terms of assets that you really care about. You know, oxen and sheep and goats and so forth. These were for work and they were for travel. So think about it a little bit like that, okay? It says in chapter 22, starting at verse 1, "If a man steals an ox or a sheep and kills it, he shall repay 5 oxen for an ox, and 4 sheep for a sheep." Ooh. So now that's okay, it sounds like the man is making a business out of this, doesn't it? So the man steals an ox and then he either kills it or he sells it. He turns around and sells it. Okay, so this is like black market items being stolen. Then remember, there are no jails. There's no jail tent out in the wilderness, okay? So if you wanted to stay in the encampment, if you wanted to stay as part of the family, you're going to pay, and you're going to pay big time. So this is not a case of something being fair. This is about things being on a whole different scale. God is not talking about things necessarily being fair and square. He wants this to be something that's going to fix the situation so that people don't do it again. And basically, the way you do that is you make it so the thief really, really, really has to pay for his crime. It's not just that he's going to pay a little, he's going to pay a lot. Put it in today's language. Suppose you have somebody who steals a car that, let us say, it's worth $20,000. Blue book value, it's $20,000, and that person steals the car. And then he takes it to a chop shop, and they dismantle the car for parts, and then they intend to sell it on the black market. They get caught, the police arrest them, they're brought to trial, and they're convicted. Now, in the sentencing for that, under Torah, the thief who stole your car worth $20,000 would have to repay you between $80,000 to $100,000. Okay, and that goes back to the victim. That does not go to the government so that the government can make good money on the theft. This goes directly to the victim. The victim is the person who owned the car and the car was stolen. So that person is the one who's going to get not just restitution, he's going to get retribution. And out of this, what's going to happen is that the car thief, the professional car thief, is going to learn, you're not going to be doing that. Now, under Torah, if they do that, if they can't make the payment, then they'll be sold as slaves, and they'll pay off the debt to the original owner over a course of time. Now, suppose it's not anything more than, say, a young person who steals a car and goes out for a joyride. What does it say? Well, in verse 4 it says, if the stolen beast is found alive and in his possession, whether it is an ox or a donkey, he shall pay double. Okay, so if you have a young man who steals your car and goes for a joyride, the police find him, they stop him, and maybe they are able to return your car in as good a shape as it was stolen. No scratches or anything. He was just out for a joyride. Then when it comes to the sentencing for this man, when convicted, he would have to not only return that car, he would also have to buy you the value of another car, or he would have to give you, another car of equal value, or the money thereof. So that's how God breaks it down. He wants to make theft really hurt. He does not want people to just think they can slip, slide around and get by, as we do in America today. Now, suppose somebody's breaking into your house. If a thief is found, verse 2 of chapter 22 in Exodus, if a thief is found breaking in and is struck so that he dies, there shall be no blood guilt for him. But if the sun has risen on him, there shall be blood guilt for him. Okay, in other words, if it happens at nighttime, you can't see, and of course in those days, they didn't have light switches, they didn't have lights. So you hit somebody in the dark, you're automatically considered to be not guilty. But if the sun has risen and you can see the perpetrator, then, well, now there's going to be some question as to whether it was self-defense or not. Were you lying in wait for that person, and when he broke in, you clobbered him on the head and killed him? Well, okay, now the court is going to take a little different view on that. But this is an interesting way of looking at it, isn't it? See, God is turning this thing around in many different ways. And he's trying to help. He wants people, the judges, as they make decisions in the future, sort of base their judgments on these concepts that he's laying out here. they're very broad, and there's, of course, God is not painting every kind of a detail, every kind of a situation, but he's giving some pointers on what they could do. Now let's talk about different kinds of loss. It's not a thief, but it's if a man causes a field or vineyard to be grazed over, or lets his beast loose and it feeds in another man's field, he shall make restitution from the best in his own field and in his own vineyard. Okay, well, if you accidentally left your ox out and your ox wandered into your neighbor's field or vineyard and ate the produce thereof, then you're going to have to make it up to the owner, the neighbor. And, these are things that can happen, especially in an agrarian culture. And, it's just a mark of civility to do that. If a fire breaks out and catches in thorns so that the stacked grain or the standing grain or the field is consumed, he who started the fire shall make full restitution. Well, isn't that interesting? I don't know that we even do that today. If somebody goes out in the forest and sets fire to the forest, I don't know that we even try to make that person pay for all the damage that gets done. But there have been many people who have lost homes because people want to go out and play with matches during a dry season. Okay, so here's another kind of situation where loss can occur. If a man gives to his neighbor money or goods to keep safe, and it is stolen from a man's house, then if the thief is found, he shall pay double. All right, so if the thief is found who has stolen, then he's going to pay double. Not only is the money going to have to be retrieved, or whatever items that were stolen will be retrieved, and then he's going to have to pay double. And if he's broke and he has no money, then he'll be sold into slavery, and he'll pay off for whatever amount of time it takes to pay that off. Now, if the thief is not found, the owner of the house shall come near to God to show whether or not he has put his hand to his neighbor's property. For every breach of trust, whether it is for an ox or for a donkey or sheep or for a cloak, or for any kind of lost thing of which one says, "This is it," the case of both parties shall come before God. The one whom God condemns shall pay double to his neighbor. Okay, well, so please understand that in God's economy, there is no separation of church and state. Okay? So God doesn't have it like that. And so this is an interesting way of bringing it out. And the priest would be the person who would be speaking for the Lord on this. So the Lord would be giving insight to the priest as judge, and he would make that decision. Now, whoever is the loser in this is going to pay double. It's not a perfect system, but it helps people to understand that God is watching all the time, and God is always keeping score of what's going on. A lot of times we don't think that God is really paying attention, because we see bad things happening, and seems like people are slip-sliding around and getting away with it, and no, they're not. They're not getting away with it. And God is very much watching, okay? Okay, now let's move on here. And it says in verse 10 of chapter 22, if a man gives to his neighbor a donkey or an ox or a sheep or a beast to keep safe, and it dies or is injured or is driven away without anyone seeing it, an oath by the Lord shall between them both to see whether or not he has put his hand to his neighbor's property. The owner shall accept the oath, and he shall not make restitution. You see, in these days, they didn't have banks, and they were, traveling around in tents. So they didn't have any safe way of storing things as we do, and we have safety deposit boxes at the bank, and the bank, and I will just tell you this, by the way, you may not know this, but the bank will not make good necessarily on any losses of any items that are in the safety deposit box. So if somebody steals, it gets into the vault and they steal stuff out of the safety deposit box, your safety deposit box, the bank may not make good on that at all. They'll just simply say it's not our stuff. We didn't have anything to do with that. So they do not have an obligation, a legal obligation necessarily to do that, but they might do something at a certain bank or another to help make some sort of restitution. But, this is something for us to think about, because we might be of the mindset that there should be absolute surety in life. But ultimately, things come, things go, and Jesus makes reference to this, and I'll talk about that in just a moment here. And so, in verse 10, it says, "If a man gives to his neighbor a donkey or an ox or sheep or any beast to keep safe, and it dies or is injured or is driven away without anyone seeing it, an oath by the Lord shall be between them to see whether or not he has put his hand to his neighbor's property. They shall make restitution to its owner. But if it is stolen from him, he shall make restitution." Okay, so this is a little bit hard, but suppose an owner is leaving town and he wants to leave his ox with a neighbor who's a very trusted neighbor, and it turns out that the animal gets stolen, but the man watching over the ox didn't see it happen. It still says that he needs to make restitution. He should have maybe done better by that. It says, "But if it is stolen from him, he shall make restitution to its owner. If it is torn by beasts, let him bring it as evidence. He shall not make restitution for it." Well, it's a different thing. If the ox is out in the field and wolves pounce on the ox and kill it, then that shows that the animal was really not secretly stolen by the one watching over the ox, but it was instead it was stolen, or it was destroyed by animals. So wild animals, you don't have to make any kind of restitution for that. Okay, and now what about borrowing from neighbors? Have you ever done that? Borrowed from neighbors? I don't know how many times I've loaned things out to people, and if it ever comes back, it comes back broken many times. Sometimes it comes back whole, but I've kind of learned over the years to just not be too grabby about things, because they have this marvelous way of slipping right through my fingers, So here's what he says in verse 14. "If a man borrows anything of his neighbor, and it is injured or dies, the owner not being with it, he shall make full restitution." Okay, so let's say you borrow your neighbor's lawnmower and he's not around, and you break the lawnmower. Guess what? You get to buy your neighbor a brand new lawnmower, or a used one, or something of equivalent value. If the owner was with it, he shall not make restitution. If it was hired, it came for its hiring fee. Okay, well now that's talking about like hiring an animal to be used perhaps for grazing. I know some people will hire a goat herder to come in and bring their goats and just sort of clear out all the brambles and all the bushes, berry bushes and so forth. If any of the animals get injured or killed in the process of that, then the person who's hiring the work to be done shall not be liable for anything that happens to the animals. That's the goat herder's responsibility. And so these are basic things related to civility and making sure that as the people enter into the promised land, they're going to have all kinds of laws to help them. Some of these laws, you can see how they work very well for nomadic people, but there's going to be more laws that will come along that will identify with people who are landowners, and that's going to come into greater play later on. I would like to just share a couple of things with you out of the New Testament here. And I need to use my glasses to see it. Yeah, because I don't see as well as I used to. Okay. All right. And this is something for us to really carefully consider. And this might very well be true right now, because I know many of you are hurting. You don't have jobs, or you've been cut back in your hours with jobs. And it just seems like, this situation that you're going through right now is very, very unfair in so many different ways and on so many different levels. But I just want you to listen to this, because the Savior really wants to help us to understand things aright, okay? He says in Matthew chapter 6, starting at verse 19, he says, "Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy, where thieves break in and steal, but lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." Can you hear me on that? Where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. What are you treasuring today? Is it the things of this world? Because, you've probably found that so many things that you trusted in before, they can disappear on you very quickly. You could lose your job overnight for no reason at all. You didn't do anything wrong, is what I'm saying. And we have some people who've lost their jobs. They might be feeling very poorly about themselves right now, but I just want you to know that's not your fault, okay? That is not your fault. You're doing all the right things, and the Lord knows this, okay? And then I want to take us over to John chapter 10, because Jesus talks here about theft as well. And you want to know who's the greatest thief of all? That's Satan. And he says in John chapter 10, verse 10, he says, "The thief comes to steal and to kill and to destroy. I came that they may have life and have it abundantly." So many things can be stolen. The things that we possess, they can be stolen from us. But the devil cannot take Jesus from you. The devil has no capacity to rob you of your salvation, to rob you of your position in him. The great missionary Jim Elliot said, "He is no fool who gives what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose." And I hope that you will keep that in mind, saints, as you're going forward this next week. What we've covered here in Exodus chapter 22 has been all about helping to lay the foundations for civilization in the area of dealing with theft and losses. And so we have whole chapters in the Washington State Criminal Code that deal with all of these different kinds of things. But the reality is that we need to set our hearts and our lives more and more on the things that really matter, which are the things that are of heaven. Keep looking up. Thank you so much for listening to me.